So Max, why don't we start off with you introducing yourself and the North Carolina Resource Center so we get a good feel for kind of the context and the work that you do to start off.
Thank you, Ken. Really much appreciated. Well, my name is Max Dispositi. I go by Max, so no worries there. My accent is not quite from Oceanside. I'm Italian, and so I grew up in Italy for 30 years and then moved here. So my background has been in nonprofit management and leadership just because I always loved to be in the service industry. I'm one of those people that when I see disparities or things that need to be done, I jump in. As an LGBT resource center, we provide resources here in North San Diego County to family and individuals that happen to be LGBT. And what that looks like, it's we provide from clinical services like behavioral health, specialized services that usually people don't have access to throughout North County, to support groups through working with school districts, private institutions, even corporations. They love to call us and do training and presentations around, diversity and inclusion. So I would say here in North San Diego County, when people are thinking about LGBTQ awareness training, they definitely come to us. In doing this work, we started looking at ourselves as well, right? Because you can't go around and tell people what to do and not look at your own organizations and your own, leadership, infrastructure. And we started really dealing with how we ourselves need to be more diverse and more inclusive.
So I'm curious about, obviously with all the social unrest that happened in early 2020 with George Floyd and things that were percolating before that, certainly, but it really accelerated and kind of came to a head in early 2020. Have you since then, have you seen more outreach, more companies coming to you, asking for training, development, and just trying to find ways to be more sensitive, more inclusive in their own organization?
Definitely. And also because ourselves, we structure our training. We used to call them competency training, but we don't do that anymore. Also, even coming to the understanding that it really learning, it's a journey, right? It's not just an added value of information that you gather and now you're competent about. So in doing our presentations, we have become more inclusive, also the diversity within our own community. So the LGBT community is very diverse. A lot of people sometimes don't come to resolute that unless you're part of the community. And the majority of people that we serve here at the center, close to 70% of people happen to come from Black, Indigenous, and communities, Latinos community here in North County. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I'm not gonna, dive into it unless you want me to. But mostly, I would say because we provide services, we tap into those disparities, that has to do with healthcare and support and education that usually affects this community in particular. So as we were doing our presentations and training, we realized that, like I said before, that we needed to not only be inclusive of those voices that usually be mostly marginalized, even within our community, the LGBT community in the US in particular, and how we could really step up, right, in terms not just of representation, but also to make sure that people were fully and truly represented. Mm-hmm. Now, we were fortunate because our center was funded by a very diverse group of people, not just when it comes to gender and sexual orientation, but in general as ethnicity and background. So I would say our struggle was a little bit less. So when the 2 years ago social unrest started, we were very prepared to navigate through those changes. Mostly because we connected with those communities years before all of that happened. So we are in a strong partnerships with community of color here in North County, the NWCP, actual organizations that do work in the region. And because we wanted to learn from them and we wanted to also share our experience with them about, the LGBT community. So we were quite prepared for this. And so I would say that really was a testimony for us to understand how important this work is, which it shouldn't just be occasional or once in a while or as a reminder, but mostly like how do we make it part of our infrastructure, right? Our policy making, our hiring choices that we make and so forth, right? Yeah, how do we go out recruiting people, right? That even every single thing that every choice we make has to have a lens of equity, if you may, that can help us through.
Yeah. Well, and I like what you said at the outset as well, is that not only are you providing these services to others, but you're also having to figure out how to handle it and navigate it yourselves with your own hiring and retention and, letting somebody go, whatever it might be, same kind of thing. Can you provide a little bit insight about the kind of training that you do I know you've mentioned a very broad, cross-section, education to law enforcement to companies. Can you maybe give us a sense for what those trainings look like and kind of the specifics? Yeah.
I would say, well, obviously they're different, right? I mean, if I go in a school district, it will be completely different. There is a 30% of the training that's quite similar. It has to do with language, diversity, what compose our LGBT community. But then if I go to a behavioral health, let's say a clinic that provides mental health services, we dive into the disparity, how they're manifested within that community, right? So I would say every environment is different. This is where obviously for a corporation, the interests are not so much what the police does or not does, or behavioral health is more about, for instance, the use or not of gender pronouns within your entity. Are they beneficial? Why people are doing that? Should you do that? Or perhaps understanding how to support your own employees. We like to believe that we're all inclusive and supportive, but then when you're looking at our policies, sometimes we miss to even spell out that support. And for instance, let's say you have a transgender employee that you care so much for, and all of a sudden they're transitioning within your workplace. How do you go about supporting them? It's only an HR thing, or should you get involved? What to ask or not ask, how to go by, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know, right, Ken? So sometimes we make a lot of mistakes, not because we mean harm or we mean, anything negative. It's just because we don't know. And we use our common sense. That is not always the way to go for certain things, especially if our experience is limited. So I would say those are the things that we tailor towards, environments. We really build that training with the receiving, if you want to say that. We usually have meetings prior to say, hey, what are your goals? Why are you doing that? And sometimes some companies tell us, well, we're doing this because we really have an issue, right? And of course, we keep the confidentiality of those conversations. We don't go out saying this company or that company has a problem. We are there with them and meet them where they are. Other times it's just because they are doing a journey of going deeper about diversity and what that means for their company. So we are there to provide our perspective. So yeah, it's quite complex and diverse at the same time.
Right, sure, yeah. Well, I mean, as you know, I'm the father of an adult trans son, and my wife is a marriage and family therapist, focusing pretty heavily on the LGBTQ community as well. And so from a behavioral health perspective alone, as you said, there's an awful lot of need out there, and also uncertainty and lack of support too. So it's great to have a center like that. I'm curious about, for example, there are things like pronouns, for example, and only recently in the last year or so has LinkedIn, for example, now allows you to put your pronouns in there. I had put mine in actually manually about a year or so ago, a little over a year ago, but now it allows you that as well. But there are things like that, which I think help to kind of normalize, if you will, and kind of spread the word about how this treatment of everybody being equal is not, you shouldn't be unique, right? It should be given. Are there other things that you counsel your corporate clients or even your education clients to do that will help normalize and break down the barriers of conversation?
I would say hiring practices, right? Sometimes organizations comes to us when they have a problem and say, oh my God, Max, we just hired this person. They're amazing. They happen to be trans. We don't know how to start the conversation with our peers. I know they're going to be fine, but what that even means and things like that. By the way, I'm talking about California, right? Because as you know, other states might have and come with different set of rules sometimes. California, where in 16 other states where there are full protections for all our LGBT individuals. Not many people know, Ken, that, for instance, LGBT people are not protected under federal law from employment discrimination. Take in consideration, a lot of people might come with that heaviness with them because maybe they're afraid to even share that they happen to be part of the LGBT community because of their past experience. So it's truly, you can get fired in the majority of the states if you happen to be LGBT for whatever reason attached to your identity that your employer might not just feel comfortable around. So there are not protections unless you're in government office. You're an employee of the government that protects LGBT people on the workplace. So what we advise people to do to be more intentional on their, not just giving for granted that, we have gay people in our company, we have trans people, so that means we're inclusive. Well, that's definitely important, but it's not enough. Sometimes how we are intentional in our affirming practices, and again, could be a policy procedure, or could be your hiring practices. Have you looked about your intake forms where you do interview with your with your future employees? Are you actually giving them an opportunity to express themselves? And I know in the hiring practices, there are a lot of limitations, right? Because intentionally, a lot of things are not disclosed to avoid biases, but there are ways on how, in an affirming way, not just to collect data, but actually showing your candidate that you are an LGBT affirming employer, right? It could be like in your speech or your spiel about your company, you can share about what you've done about diversity and inclusion. And maybe you can say, I don't know, Pride, we go and support Pride events,
right?
Or we donate to organizations in a community, or anything that shows an affirmation without people having to come and ask you, because then it feels like something secret, or almost like you have it, but it's there just because everybody has it, not because it's really important to you, right? So I think, really paying attention about how intentional we are. And like I said, Ken, we're doing this work ourselves, folks. So this is not something, even with our LGBT community, even with our diverse LGBT community. So when we go out, we try to recruit in the right places. And sometimes in places where nobody goes.
To your point, you have to be very, very intentional, very deliberate. You have to deliberately go and recruit from historically Black colleges or from minority colleges, or also just things like changing your job descriptions around to not require a degree, for example. If you look at different populations out there, people of color, the percentage of folks in those populations that have degrees is lower than the white population. So if every job description says you have to have a 4-year degree, well, you're already eliminating a good portion of the minority population, people of color, because of the expectation. And to your point about being deliberate about it as well, there are a lot of companies that I know where they have specific either Black employee committees or Hispanic employee committees or Indigenous peoples or whatever it might be, but also LGBTQ as well, committees and groups and employee segments, if you will, in their company. And if you're talking about that on your website and during interviews, that's going to demonstrate very quickly that you are seen as a more diverse and outwardly inclusive organization also.
Truly. And also, sometimes we undermine how much the marketing material that we put out there reflects who we are, right? There is a tendency, unfortunately, Ken, for many years, we have an idea of what professional looks like. And there are all these, so to speak, clean images that are really to profession about representing the typical employee of your company that tends to leave out so many folks, right?
Right. You have to really, for those companies that don't have an in-house marketing team or, even a studio, obviously, and you go to a more stock photo place to find images for your website, you have to really, really search to find more diverse pictures.
Definitely the marketing strategies, even when you don't have a marketing team, being proactive and intentional on what you put out there, I think is really important.
Yeah, I agree. So are there things that people can do either individually or their organizations to support those organizations, and then by nature then other policy or kind of policy attributes, if you will, or initiatives on a broader basis? You
can do advocacy, like telling folks, or your elected official, hey, this is something that's really dear to us and it's important for us to reduce the disparity here or there. So right now there is a national organization, different ones that are pushing for the Equality Act. That, folks, has been 20 years now that we try to pass, and no matter who is in charge. So you see, sometimes it doesn't, no matter who is in charge, it never does. So that Equality Act will extend the civil rights law that we have in the US just to include LGBT people. And there is an incredible pushback, and we never had the numbers to pass it. So here we are. We have a map of the US where if you travel through the country, your own adopted child could not be recognized because you're an LGBT couple. So a lot of folks are still experiencing a lot of discriminatory practices here in the US. And because in California, we have people coming from all over the world to work here, again, making note of that and supporting those efforts when possible, I think it's the great thing to do for a lot of companies, right?
Exactly. And to your point earlier, making sure that companies realize that even though they may be headquartered in California, if they have employees in other states that are not as supportive or inclusive, you have to be aware of that and be careful with that too, whether it's a training or anything else. And I think one of the great things about the U.S. obviously is that you can vote, with your wallet, right, with your pocketbook.
Right. Yeah. I think it's nice to see when businesses are really taking a stand on that. I mean, and it's not about. I know sometimes people think, oh, what do you have to do? Why you have to get involved in that? But it has to do with the people you're serving. If you're a service provider of any kind, or you serve a product size for a particular population, and that population is actually targeted, you can't just profit out of nowhere without saying anything or standing up, for the people that you're serving. It could be a shampoo that you only produce for, people of color because of their particular hair or whatever it is. You can't just do the profits without even being sensitive about what those people are actually experiencing. That's
true, because we're a recruiting company. Obviously, we're in a unique position as we talk to clients, and we talk about how we are really focused on bringing them a diverse slate of candidates, trying to find other places to recruit people from, whether it's female candidates in a very tech heavy or STEM heavy industry, or people of color, or whatever that may be. We're really focusing hard on that. It takes ongoing work and very deliberate work, to the point where we've talked to clients also where you may focus very heavily on trying to diversify your workforce, and then you hire your first, let's say, person of color. If that person comes in the organization and they don't feel welcome, they feel like they're an outsider, they're not listened to, they're not acknowledged, or what have you, and they don't ever see anybody else like them around them, they're not going to stay very long. Right. So it takes that ongoing, effort, if you will, both in training, but also in just awareness, to really make it stick and have it make a long-term impact. Yeah. Well, and there's so many different facets. I mean, you mentioned about, kind of the application process for hiring too. I mean, things like, do you just have, when you have somebody fill out an application, does it just say male, female, gender? Right. There's a very small thing, but the majority of people use the same application they've used for 100 years. Right. Or health benefits. Right. Does your whatever health benefits you're offering to your employees, do they offer support for non-traditional, services? Right. And does it cover? And can you go someplace where you're going to feel comfortable as someone in the LGBT community? You're going to find a clinician, a doctor that's going to make you feel comfortable with who you are and not try to put you in a box. So they're very small little things in and of themselves, but they make a really big difference if it's done correctly.
Truly.
Yeah, great. All right, so the last couple of minutes that we have here, what advice would you give? What things would you, where do we start, right? I mean, these are all very big issues. Nothing's going to be solved overnight, but what are the little things that we can do maybe to help with awareness, or kind of help to bridge that gap?
I would say make it yours. Speak your language. I mean, each organization has its own culture, right? When you're talking about, there has been an attempt in the past 2 years. Everybody now is doing this training and diversity inclusion. Let's create, a couple of employees are in charge of that, rushing through that process. I think you just have to be not just intentional, but also truthful on what you are, and not being afraid to talk to your employees and say, hey, this is where we are. Obviously, we haven't reached this level yet, but we want to get there. Help us to do that. So speak your own language. Don't try to bring something in that might feel just, from the outside world, but it's not reflected on what you're doing. Right. So in your case, for instance, your particular organization, as it's all about the hiring practices, how you talk to people, where you promote, right, those positions. Also your questions to your own clients as, hey, how inclusive it is. Are you really looking for diversity, or you're looking in reality do you have in mind an idea of what your candidate should look like, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So things like that, I think, bring your own culture into it. And so that feels organic. It doesn't look like something that comes from the outside, try to come in, right? Force.
Right.
And I'm all about holistic growth. And in this case, that will mean having this conversation like you're having today and see, okay, what that means for us now. Let's write down a focus group maybe, and let's start looking about what it means for us to be more inclusive, or how it's going to be reflected in this particular company.
Right.
That could be a way to go.
That's a really good point. Yeah, don't try to kind of bolt on something that's not
borrow,
natural.
Borrow things from others.
Yeah, right. You got to make sure you're kind of integrating it into how you operate.
Right.
So that it makes sense. And I think it's also, it's a bit of it's a cliche, but that tone at the top, right? If it's just being championed by HR, but that the CEO or the owners of the board are really not in support of whatever the initiative is, it's not going to last very long. It's got to be a comprehensive initiative and strategy by all the senior leadership team, if you will, to really have a true impact.
In a healthy company, everybody has an idea without the training as well, right? They know exactly what the boundaries means, what certain things you can ask or not ask, and so forth. So with time, we're hoping that this anti-biases cultural awareness that it's, a lot of companies are doing, are bringing that in a more sensitive way, so that people are really making, they have a better understanding about what that even means.
Right. Sure. Exactly. Right. And again, back to our comment at the very beginning, normalizing it. So it's not, not unusual to have training on anti-bias. It's not unusual to have training around how to be more inclusive and sensitive. So it's going to take some time, but like you, I hope we get there, and we're doing whatever we can to help. That's
right.